Total war has erupted in Ukraine, and we're now seeing the familiar scenes of large numbers of civilian casualties. Bombed apartment blocks and lines of desperate refugees streaming away to escape the worst of the dangers. Socialists all over the world will be expressing their solidarity with the working class of Ukraine, facing the greatest military onslaught in Europe since the Second World War. We stand with the Ukrainian people, not only because of the humanitarian horror that is threatening, although that is potentially dangerous, but because it is a war that is against the interests of working people in this country, in Russia, and in the whole world. Following overwhelming Russian incursions in the Donbass region, in the north of Ukraine, and along the Black Sea coast, Russia is deploying its largest military force since 1945. It is not clear what the war aims of the Kremlin are, but would seem too incredible to imagine that Putin is contemplating a long and bloody war to occupy the whole of Ukraine. The problem would not be so much the conquest of the country, given Russian military prominence that is possible, but holding it. It is possible that Putin is calculating on the occupation of only enough Ukrainian territory to be able to negotiate from a position of strength, perhaps combining that with the imposition of a no-fly zone across the rest of Ukraine. Putin would demand in any peace deal that a permanent ban on Ukrainian membership of NATO, recognition of the separate Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and recognition of Russian Crimea. The day before the invasion, it had been reported that the Ukrainian President Zelensky has made a telephone approach to Putin, which was rebuffed, and Putin may feel that the approach was an indication that Kyiv had already felt itself in an extremely weak position even before the invasion. Importantly, the uneasy arrangement between Putin and the Russian oligarchs, whereby he retains supreme political power and they are free to make vast profits, have been dramatically destabilized. Even if hundreds of billions are stashed away by the Kremlin as a war chest, the ability to the billionaire class to move their wealth around the world, buy luxury properties overseas, and generally live it up on a global scale is now all in jeopardy. Russian billionaire oligarchs are now international pariahs. Even with the military and perhaps the security service, there'll be resentment by the professional soldier caste at having to fight in Ukraine, something for which none of them signed up for. It all adds up to an extremely unstable apple cart at the top of Russian society. We know that thieves can fall out, and there is no less true of the kleptocracy that runs for Russia as for anywhere else. Socialists are internationalists, and we do not recognize as legitimate so-called spheres of influence, which are simply an acceptance of involuntary domination of small states by larger states. But that, in a nutshell, is Putin's excuse for war. The invasion was launched because the encroachment of EU domination economically and NATO domination military towards Eastern Europe, Ukraine has historically been within the Russian sphere of influence and has strong historic and cultural ties with Russia. So the encroachment of NATO and the EU are precisely what is questioned here. Having seen 13 former Stalinist satellite states as part of the former USSR joining NATO, Putin has decided that he cannot accept such a large, potentially prosperous and populous country like Ukraine going the same way as the others. Putin's intervention in Ukraine, therefore, is not at all the interest of Ukrainian Russian speakers. It is no liberation struggle, but a matter of the geopolitical power, prestige, and influence of Moscow. It is also, just as importantly, a means of enhancing Putin's prestige at home and silencing his growing number of critics. In Europe and the countries of NATO, we're now experiencing an orgy of flag waving and patriotism. Boris Johnson has, at long last, his ambition to play the role of latter-day Churchill. Biden, already a lame duck president 2 years before the end of his administration, is desperate to appear strong in the face of Russian aggression. These two in particular are putting pressure on Germany, Italy, France, and the smaller EU countries to bolster support for economic sanctions against Russia, whereas Europe is reluctant to do without Russian gas, which provides 40% of European gas needs and 55% for Germany. The USA is happy to see full embargo that would benefit their own oil and gas industry. The flag waving and posturing by NATO is mostly for home consumption. There is no question whatsoever of direct military support from NATO or the West, and is looking increasingly difficult for even military supplies to be flown in. Socialists need to express their unqualified opposition to the invasion of Ukraine, but do not oppose the Russian invasion from the standpoint of the warmongers like the British and the American governments. It is deeply ironic that the only comparison to the huge military assault on Ukraine in modern times was the ever greater military assault on Iraq in 2003 by the same very hypocritical NATO allies. That was a war of shock and awe too, of overwhelming military forces. A war fought like this one on the basis of outright lies and deceit. It was, moreover, a war with a far higher toll of Iraqi military and civilian casualties than the current conflict, and it left Iraq as a wasteland. And wars are an inevitable feature of capitalism. Socialists are and should be opposed to all imperialist wars, the inevitable products of which are deaths, destructions, and great economic dislocation, all borne by workers and working class youth in uniform. Wars are an inevitable feature of capitalism as much as disease, poverty, and economic crisis. As the Prussian military theorist Clausewitz explains, war is the continuation of politics by other means. In modern times, it meant that wars arise inexorably from the rivalries between the separate national capitalist classes, played out as a struggle for markets, profit, power, and prestige on the international plane. But we are not Quakers either, and we do not oppose war from the moral standpoint, but from what is the best interest of the working class and the labour movement internationally. We view the development of war and the answer to war from a class standpoint. We put no confidence or faith in the idea of an international law. There is no such thing as an international law, either based on the UN or any other organisation, including groups like the Security Council, except on those few occasions where there is a consensus between the great powers. Where there is no consensus, such as the status of illegal Jewish settlements on confiscated Palestinian land, then there is no law and no legal sanctions are applied. International law had no effect on the overthrow of the duly elected government of Iran in 1953, or that of Chile in 1973. It had no value in the illegal invasion of Iraq by the US-UK-led coalition in 2003, and it will carry no weight and no threat against the Russian rape of Ukraine today. Socialists will not participate in any shape or form with the bandwagon and the hysteria of the mainstream media, which reflects the real interests of the ruling class. This is true in the case of virtually every element of the national press, in the UK, the EU, and the USA, and in Russia. We do not give any credence and not a morsel of support to the alliances of capitalist states, NATO in particular. NATO has never been an agency of democracy or security, but has served the diplomatic and military interests of the European powers and the USA. This is the most politically significant conflict in Europe since 1945. The tame mouthpieces in the national media are full of the myth of Ukraine being the first European war since the end of the Second World War. It is certainly the most politically significant military conflict in Europe since 1945, and it has seen the deployment of the largest land, sea, and air invasion, but it's by no means the first major conflict. The press have conveniently forgotten about the Balkans, and the fact that 23 years ago, NATO was bombing the Serbian capital, Belgrade. There were tens of thousands of casualties in that war, mostly civilians, more than we have yet to see in the Ukrainian conflict. Even in Ukraine itself, since 2014, there have been 14,000 casualties in the long drawn-out conflict along the demarcation line between Ukraine-held and separatist-held areas in the southwest. The hysterical tone of the press, the flag-waving and the trumpeting of support for NATO are aimed at cowing the British and European populations and preparing them to have to pay for the huge economic fallout of the Ukraine war. And we're already seeing that with a lot of Liz Truss speech at the moment. It is a measure of the degeneration of the Labour leadership that on NATO and on defence they are completely indistinguishable from the Tories. They base their whole outlook on the continuation of the capitalist system in Britain and internationally, and so it is inevitable that they will also follow the military alliances of international capitalism. But of course, the Tories will always have bigger Union Jacks than Labour. Left Horizons has no significant readership or support in Russia, but if our supporters were activists there, they would oppose the intervention in Ukraine and demand the withdrawal of Russian troops. We can draw important political lessons today from the attitude of the Trotskyist Workers' International League, or the WIL. Toward the Second World War, and comrades should read the writings of Ted Grant from the time, the WIL did not oppose the principle of war against Nazism, because that was the instinctive view of the best workers. From a class standpoint, they opposed the conduct of war by the capitalist class. The sacrifices, the casualties, the belt tightening, and even rationing were all weighted against the working class, and these issues the WIL focused on. The WIL called for the public ownership of industry, starting with the arms industries, for democratic workers' control, and for democratic arming of the working class as a defense against Nazism. Of course, The ruling class would not tolerate that, and even the Home Guard was rigorously controlled from above. When all else failed, the British ruling class would have capitulated to the Nazis, as the French ruling class did in 1940, rather than handing power to the working class. It is not clear how much is even possible for an independent movement of workers to exist and to campaign in Ukraine, but socialists, where they can put forward slogans and demands, would support the principle of defending Ukrainian independence against Russian occupation. We must demand full democratic rights for all minority languages. Kyiv government would demand the government arm all workers on the basis of rank-and-file democratic control, and for fascist and semi-fascist militias to be disbanded. Socialists should demand that the government arm all workers on the basis of rank-and-file democratic control, and for fascist and semi-fascist militias to be disbanded. They would demand the renationalization of all industries privatized in Ukraine since 1991, including the mines and industries of the southeast, and an end to any profiteering during the war. Socialists in Ukraine would demand full democratic rights for all national minorities and recognition of all minority languages. Hungarian, Polish, and Russian. They would demand full autonomy for Ukrainian regions, even to the point of separation, if that is the wish of the majority. Left Horizons does not base itself on this or that nationalism, but on internationalism and the solidarity and struggles of workers worldwide. We will not be reframing our Facebook profiles in the blue and yellow because our flags stay red. Leon Trotsky, in anticipating the approaching Second World War, said that the choice facing humanity was socialism or barbarism. But in the modern epoch, it is more than that. Such is the rottenness of capitalism, and so high are the stakes. Not excluding climate change, for example, the choice before humanity is now socialism or annihilation. We have to use the tragic events like those unfolding in Ukraine as a spur to drive us forward and change society.